Evening, wherever in the world you're joining us from. Welcome to the 7th Oxford University Press History Book Club meeting. My name is Susan Ferber, and I'm one of the history editors at OUP. On behalf of my colleagues, thank you for taking the time to join us today. For those of you who have been at previous book club meetings featuring Thomas Holt's The Movement, Kevin Weddle's The Complete Victory, Annalise Heinz's Mahjong, Phoebe Young's Camping Grounds, Gordon Campbell's Norse America, or Carter Malkasian's The American War in Afghanistan, welcome back. If you didn't get to see these live, you can find the recordings for all of them on OUP's YouTube channel. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, here's a little background. Reading and talking about books in a group has a long tradition. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the first secular American reading circles, or conversations, a precursor to book clubs, were begun. They required little more than a thirst for literature and a desire to discuss it with like-minded individuals, to talk about challenging ideas, to learn together, and hopefully to have some fun along the way. That's the spirit in which this book club was founded. What we lack in intimacy of a small group, I hope we can gain in creating a broad community of readers. This book club will give you a chance to directly interact with the authors, as well as an opportunity to continue the conversation online with others in the book club. Every meeting features 2 OUP authors in conversation, in this case the writer of a new book with one of our backlist titles. Over time, we aim to share histories from across the globe, from a variety of periods of history, and many different authorial perspectives. For those of you who don't know how long it takes to research, write, and publish books, you may think that the topic of today's book was signed because the U.S. Postal Service was much in the news before the 2020 election. In fact, the federal government has used its power through the Postal Service for a far longer period, and while its services are often taken for granted, it's been the part of the federal government that has most touched our everyday lives. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our book and authors today. This is the most bare-bones description of these historians, since we could easily take a half an hour just to talk about their accomplishments. Cameron Blevins teaches U.S. and digital history at the University of Colorado, Denver, especially Western history, and you'll be hearing today about how his work on mapping of digital techniques and spatial history informed this book. He is joined in conversation by Edward Ayers, Tucker Boatwright Professor of the Humanities and President Emeritus at the University of Richmond. He is the author of many books, most recently Southern Journey, The Migrations of the American South, 1790 to 2020, but is also well known for his award-winning OUP book, The Promise of the New South, Life After Reconstruction. You may know him too from his hosting of NPR's Backstory with the American History Guys and from his tireless work in public history in multiple media. Cameron and Ed are going to speak for about 35 minutes, and then the floor will be open to your questions. You can start putting them in the chat anytime, and my colleague Erin Cox will bring up as many as she can in the second period of the book club. You can also go to @OUP History Twitter feed and comment using the hashtag OUP History Book Club. Welcome, Cameron Ed. Thank you for being here. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Susan. It's great to see everyone, virtually at least, and great to talk with Cameron Blevins, a younger colleague whom I've long admired, who's carrying forward some of the irrational interest in digital history that some of us have sustained for a while. But let's talk first about this really handsome book that OUP has produced. It's really nice to see how it turned out in the final version, and the beautiful maps and so forth, and the beautiful prose in it as well. So what I'd like to know is, why the post office, Cameron?
Thank you, Ed. And I want to start just by saying thank you to Susan and OUP for putting this together. And obviously, thank you, Ed, for both joining us today and also all the kind of work you've done in the field of digital history and kind of laying a path for those of us that are embarking on this work now. So I appreciate that. So the question, why the post office? I kind of think about it in terms of 2 main reasons. First is that I've always kind of been fascinated by really large systems, network structures that are kind of everywhere, but are completely taken for granted, that you just rarely think about.
So you might even have a conversation across the whole nation, say, for example, about a new book.
Right, right. Just being able to kind of magically converse from 1,000 miles away, which we are doing now and have been for the last year and a half without really giving it a second thought at this
Right,
point.
right.
And I think oftentimes I would use some analogies today, such as Facebook is this kind of massive system that no one ever thinks about, or infrastructure that no one ever thinks about. But unfortunately, both of those are actually front page news right now. So maybe the analogy doesn't quite work in that sense.
We liked it better when we didn't think about them, right?
Exactly, exactly. But I think things like that, right? Infrastructure, these kind of massive social networks today do embody a lot of what I'm kind of interested in and talking about here, which is there's something compelling about how these systems kind of shape and structure our lives and the ways in which we interact with them. And in the 19th century, I would argue that there's no other institution really that was so kind of universally shared and universally used and accessed by so many different Americans at the time. The postal system in the 19th century operated in practically every community across the country, with some exceptions. And effectively speaking, no matter where you lived, you were able to kind of access this network. And 19th century Americans, much like today, took that for granted. That
So
they were
let
able
me pause
to.
there, if I
Yeah,
might,
yeah.
a little bit. Since your book is really about the post-Civil War era, I'd like to know a little bit about the backstory of the post office. When did it become so important? You demonstrate very clearly that it's important to the creation of the American West. I happen to notice there's some dots on there when your maps begin as well. Can you give us a quick tutorial on the evolution of the post office?
Absolutely. And I should note that the historian Richard John has basically kind of paved the way for all of this, wrote a very, very important book called Spreading the News that made the claim and laid out in very clear terms that the postal system really has been here since the very founding of the country and was actually critical to these the early years of the United States. It was established almost immediately as part of a kind of extension of the colonial mail, but very quickly kind of turned into its own system. And from the beginning, it acted as a way to knit this really young new nation together, and one that was kind of, these 13 disparate former colonies, now states, spread out across the eastern seaboard. And the US Post became the ways in which people were able to communicate with each other. The government actually subsidized the transmission of newspapers as a way of keeping people informed of what was happening. Congress people were able to kind of communicate with their constituents, again, from many hundreds or thousands of miles away. And so really through the 1860s, which is where my book kind of picks up, it served this kind of connective tissue, again, from the very beginning, the nation's.
Although one thing John shows us is that letters really weren't the thing at the beginning. So much of your powerful story, begins with the story of a lost overcoat and the letter and so forth. But the post office wasn't really built to exchange letters until when did that change? Because it's certainly in place by the time your story begins.
Certainly, yeah. And so really through the 1840s, as Richard John shows, it's the transmission of newspapers and periodicals and news that's the main focus. And it was fairly expensive to send letters. Obviously people still used it. But starting in the kind of 1840s through the 1850s, there was a movement called the cheap postage movement that tried to radically reduce the cost of sending individual letters. And in doing so, it opened up the mail to many, many, many more Americans who were able to suddenly now afford it, not as a kind of occasional item, but really as part of their daily life. And you see this kind of flourishing of letter writing culture as Americans start writing letters all the time. And the historian David Henkin actually talks a lot about this as well. And that actually also coincides in the 1850s with this period of really rapid and dramatic territorial expansion in the West. And so by the mid-century, the United States had basically expanded from this kind of narrow strip on the eastern seaboard all the way into a continent spanning nation through a series of kind of conquest and territorial seizures from Mexico and among others. And suddenly the nation kind of faced, and the US postal system faced, this new reality of how do you operate a national mail system that's accessible to everyone with these kind of cheap postage rates, when suddenly it's not just connecting Virginia to North Carolina, but it's connecting New York City to San Francisco. right? And there's all sorts of implications that start to pick up in the 1860s around that. But this kind of flourishing of letter writing culture goes hand in hand with this process of territorial expansion.
Does the Civil War have anything to do with this?
Yes, it does. So I think there is the 1860s are this really pivotal decade for many reasons in American history. Obviously, the most clear one being, of course, the Civil War as this kind of cataclysmic and hugely important events. And there's a lot of scholarship in recent years that have really tried to center or reestablish the importance of the Western United States to the Civil War. That despite the fact that the majority of battles are happening on the East, this process is also unfolding in the West, and predominantly, not exclusively, what you're seeing is a turn westward and the use of the federal government and the use of the Army in particular, waging war against not just Confederates in the South, but increasingly Native people in the West. And in the wake of the Civil War, that's when you really see this military attention being turned to the Western United States as well. So the 1860s is kind of pivotal decade in general, but also for the West.
So is that military occupation tied to the spread of the post office?
It is. And so again, this kind of era of military expansion during the 1860s through the 1870s is seizing millions and millions and millions of acres of native land, effectively, plundering this land from indigenous groups that are living in the West. And what I've always kind of been fascinated with is that story is very well known. It's absolutely crucial to understanding this period of Western expansion. But just because you kind of take land and territory in the West doesn't necessarily mean that people are going to occupy that territory. And for anyone who's kind of traveled across the Western United States, there's a lot of places here that are actually quite far away and quite difficult to live in. But despite that, millions of Americans over the following decades are occupying the Western United States. And what I kind of argue is that the US Post is helping and facilitating that process by which people are able to move to these really, really distant, inhospitable places, in part because they're able to stay connected to the wider world through this really massive network.
Does the post office tend to come at the beginning of settlement of a particular place at a certain point, or does it tend to follow people?
It basically goes hand in hand. So if you kind of think about an overly simplistic pattern, I would say first is the US Army kind of waging war, taking land, occupying that land, subjugating Native people, oftentimes removing them from that land. And then you see American settlers occupying that land. And basically, as soon as groups of people are moving into these recently plundered areas, post offices are sprouting up like weeds immediately. So I think one good example is, I live in Colorado. So in Colorado during the 1860s, the western third of the state was basically owned and occupied by groups of Ute people. And in a kind of unfortunately familiar pattern, white settlers are trespassing onto that territory in the early 1870s. They discover gold in the San Juan Mountains. And then the federal government pressures Ute tribes to effectively cede 3.7 million acres of land kind of centered on the San Juan Mountains. Within a couple months, there are a dozen post offices up and running to serve all of these mining towns that are popping up. And you can see it so clearly that it's really on the front lines of settler occupation of these really distant places. Because again, southwestern Colorado is mountainous. It's literally one of the most remote places in the contiguous United States at the time. But despite that, you can move there, start working for a mine and still be able to send and receive letters to get news from, Chicago or New York. So these kind of ties that are moving between these really distant places and other parts of the country, I think are really central to this history.
So people are going to a big gleaming white building with columns in the front of it when they go to the post office?
Right. And I think that's actually one of the things that I've had to kind of reorient my thinking around is that, the U.S. Post Office today, and certainly over my lifetime, looks like a certain thing, right? You go to a government building, depending on where you are, and oftentimes it's a standalone structure. You go inside, there's someone wearing an official USPS uniform, or there's a mail carrier driving around in the official USPS white trucks, right? really outside of urban areas in the 1800s, very little of that applied to most of the US postal system. So in rural places, places like the San Juan Mountains, um, you would go to the local post office and it would be a general store. And the store owner would basically get paid, $50 a year from the federal government in commissions to hand letters across the counter of the store. And so the way in which this network was able to expand looks very, very different from a 20th century and a 21st century model.
So I've seen Westerns, and they're often behind sort of bars. They're kind of, the mail is protected in some way. Is that the way it would have been? Don't tell me the Westerns are not accurate, by the way.
Well, they're not. I kind of thought they were actually historical documentaries. So it would oftentimes look like that, where there would be kind of a particular, partitioned little spot of a general store, for instance, where the mail was kept. Honestly, though, like sometimes it was literally in someone's house, and there'd just be a sack of mail sitting there. The post office department had all sorts of kind of rules that it tried to enforce about how the mail was supposed to be handled. But if you're a store owner living in a small town, there's very little oversight, and you're just kind of trying to get through the day. So the way in which it looks on the ground is quite different, I would say.
Well, you actually have a lot of accounts of fraud, in fact, in all of this. Tell us how you would defraud the post office.
Yeah,
I'm assuming this is no longer valuable information, so I think it's fair, it's safe to distribute this information.
Right. So the episodes of fraud I mainly looked at were concentrated in the West, and in particular for stagecoach companies that were bidding on contracts to carry the mail across the Western United States. And the reason why I think fraud was able to flourish in this particular area was a couple-fold. One is that these contracts are actually quite large. They were hundreds of thousands of dollars, even up to $1 million to transport the mail. Say 400 miles across Western Texas into New Mexico, something like that. And second would be there's actually very little oversight in these kind of rural areas. The US postal system just didn't have the kind of centralized administrative capacity to be out there monitoring what's happening. And so these companies would effectively use this kind of crooked bidding system to win these mail contracts, and then they would use a process by which they kind of inflated the compensation they would get by saying, okay, well, now going to carry the mail 7 times a week instead of once a week, and suddenly the contract triples. And again, the reason why they're able to do this is because there's just not the on-the-ground presence for these kind of bureaucrats in Washington to administer the system.
So one of the things that people might be surprised about your book is how engaging it is, in the sense that you're interested in networks and systems and so forth, right? And yet you manage to really add all this texture. How do you go about imagining and writing a history of something like the post office?
Yeah, it's the way I kind of think about it is oftentimes I would find myself having to operate at 2 different scales, 2 different spatial scales. And at the biggest kind of scale, we're dealing with the largest postal system in the entire world by several factors. And in fact, it's a network that is in some ways more expansive than it is today. There's about, in the 1800s, late 1800s, there's about 2 to 3 times as many post offices operating as there are in the 21st century. And just to kind of give some comparative statistics here, in 1899 there were basically more post offices than if you were to tally up every single McDonald's restaurant in the United States, and then add on top of that every Starbucks, every Dunkin' Donuts, every Pizza Hut, every Taco Bell, Burger King. You have this giant fast food Frankenstein conglomerate, and there would still be fewer discrete locations than there were post offices at the close of the 1800s. And so trying to conceptualize this really, really broad scale was one of the challenges, but also one of the ways in which I kind of got to some of the insights of the book for some of these larger scale patterns. But in some sense, right, thinking about how I started this by like conceptualizing big networks, I think some of the most effective ways is to really drop down to the ground level and go back to the scale of the individual person, and trying to study how people interacted with this giant system, and more importantly, I think some of the meaning that that giant system had in their lives. And for me, that was going into the archives, that was looking at individual letters by people, closely reading the ways in which they're using the mail and studying some of the kind of everything from kind of the economic ways they're using it, but also even the emotional and effective ways in which they're, say, tying families together. So those two scales was one that I tried to kind of weave in throughout the book.
Can you tell us the story of the overcoat letter? Because I'm not giving away too much, since the book begins with that. Why would you choose that as an opening coat?
Yeah, it's a weird way. It's a weird way to start a book, which is basically it's a letter that was sent in the winter of 1864 by a mid-level, high-level army officer, and he'd been kind of out touring and had been at a Indian reservation in Dakota Territory, and then over the next couple of weeks, kind of made his way back to headquarters in St. Paul, Minnesota. And he sent a half-page letter that was about 2 to 3 sentences long back to someone he knew at the reservation, basically saying, "I forgot my overcoat there. You're welcome to have it." And that's it.
I guess they didn't have parcel service as effective.
Right. And so he basically said, if you find it, you're welcome to just kind of keep it. There was no official government business. There wasn't even any kind of like pleasantries talking about the weather. There was nothing except for just 2 to 3 sentences. And he mailed this letter across about 400 miles. It had to reach there, and also had to kind of traverse this area of the country that just less than a year before had been roiled by war, the Dakota War, which was basically an uprising of Dakota people that completely decimated the region. Abraham Lincoln had to actually send federal troops to Minnesota over the past year, resulted in like the largest mass execution in American history. But despite that, he's able to send what is for us the equivalent of a text message today, hundreds of miles, and have it arrive there. And that to me was this moment where I was like, wow, again, taking for granted these large systems, the ways in which that this person was able to do that just seems so incongruous with what we would kind of expect from that period and that particular moment in history. And that was what kind of useful for understanding, again, the ways in which these large systems actually kind of interact in people's lives.
Well, we think in other Westerns I've seen, they have telegraph poles along the way. What's the relationship of the post office and the telegraph, which would have seemed a faster way to have contacted your overcoat?
Yes, I have to. The telegraph was a bit faster than the mail, but I think there's a couple of misconceptions about the telegraph. I think first of all would be the geography of the telegraph was way more limited than the U.S. Post. And basically, this comes down to the fact the U.S. Post was a government public network serving a public good, and Congress and the U.S. government had kind of committed itself to providing a universal service, whereas Telegraph Company was a private network. It did not have any kind of mandate to provide service, in every single town in the country. Because of that, it's obviously not creating new lines necessarily to really distant places that might not be profitable for them. The second reason, and this is, again, Richard John's work has done quite a bit on this, is that the telegraph was actually termed the rich man's mail. And again, going back to this public-private dimension, it's really expensive to send a telegram in the 1800s. And it's way more expensive than to send a letter. You could send a letter for about 3 cents. That was lowered to 2 cents by the end of the century. A telegram is costing 50 cents, $1, 50 times as much sometimes. And so those are the kind of major differences. Not to say the telegraph, wasn't hugely important for all sorts of different reasons, but it's serving a different clientele and oftentimes serving a different purpose. If you were an ordinary American, generally speaking, you wouldn't use the telegraph except for kind of times where maybe you're sending a telegram about the death of a family member or something like that. But generally speaking, these are kind of two separate networks that do overlap in different parts of the country, but are serving two different purposes.
So you mentioned before about stagecoaches. We picture this really distended network. So how long are stagecoaches and the main way that the mail is moved? So it's still animal powered throughout the 19th century?
Yeah, way through actually into the early 20th century. The way in which you can think of it is that, 1860s are when railroad construction really starts in the Western United States. And by the 1890s, you do have a railway network kind of crisscrossing all over the West. And so you can think of those as the major arteries or trunk lines through which mail might be traveling a long distance. But if you actually look at a map of the West, most people don't live right next to a railway line, right? There's all sorts of places in the West that are miles away. And in order to transport a letter from a railway station to a mining camp, that's where stagecoaches come in. So you can think of that as kind of the rural transportation system that is then kind of distributing out from these major trunk lines.
Can you give us a sense of the speed by which, if you say send a letter from San Francisco to New York, what are we looking at?
Yeah, by the end of the century, it is taking, I believe, 6 days, something like that. And that, of course, is largely determined by the spread of the railway network.
Right.
Um, and so I'm always kind of struck, by the fact that like not only are people able to get letters, but they actually don't take that much longer than they do today in some sense, which always just kind of blows my mind that this thing even works at all. But it's kind of a remarkable system when you stop to think about it.
And judging from your comments earlier, the post offices continue to proliferate even with the railroads, and I'm assuming the telegraph that runs alongside them. So does that differentiation between poor people's mail and rich people mail, or what I'm assuming is commercial mail, right, or telegraph, does that continue throughout the whole century?
Yeah, it does. And there's different, you can think of it as kind of like time sensitive commercial information, obviously, is being transmitted by telegraph, right? So stock market price changes, any kind of major business news is going by telegraph. But for stuff that's not necessarily immediately time sensitive, the mail is still carrying a huge amount of commercial information. So if you need to mail, a mortgage or a deed or an invoice, that's all going through the mail. And there's also, the rise of the money order system, which is a means for people to kind of safely transmit small sums of money, kind of the equivalent of a check today, without the
Or
chance
Venmo, right?
of Venmo, right? Without the chance of that getting kind of stolen or lost in transit. And so there's all sorts of ways in which the Post is actually kind of propping up a lot of other commercial networks.
So you call this the Gossamer Network. Maybe you could talk about that a little bit and then show us how it is that you've enabled us to see that network.
Sure. So Gossamer, and actually, I should say, just to admit this, for a while that was the title of the book, was called Gossamer Network, and thank God we moved on from that, because in conversations I realized a lot of people have no idea have never heard of the phrase Gossamer, right? It's this very kind of academic, esoteric phrase. But the idea behind Gossamer is calling to mind a kind of lightweight, gauzy web. And the reason why I use that metaphor to talk about the US Post is that it conjures up a very different vision of a government system. I think when we think of government today, it's kind of large, stodgy, right? These kind of permanent buildings, whereas the postal system, especially in rural parts of the country, was much more lightweight and ephemeral. And so I can show a quick demonstration here.
So as you call it up, this is what Cameron and I are referring to as digital history. And this is a real pioneering site. So I could really geek out on this very much as soon as it appears here, but I'll try to be out of the way so you can talk about its evolution and where you found the data, which I think is really interesting, and what kind of capacities there are.
Sure. So a lot of the book rests on kind of mapping analysis that I did using this data set of post offices that were collected by a stamp collector and postal historian named Richard Hellbach. And what you're seeing on the screen right now is an animation of the spread of that network on a year-by-year basis. And when I say Gossamer Network, this is kind of what I mean, the ability of this network to rapidly kind of spin out these new tendrils into all different parts of the country. And with that, there's also an element that you can actually see in the 20th century here as post offices are starting to disappear from your screen. The system also was able to contract from places quite easily as well. And that was what I was struck by looking at the data, was not just that the system was able to move into all these different places with incredible speed, but also withdraw from those places. And you had post offices kind of popping up very quickly, but then disappearing within a matter of months. And so for me, that was kind of a way of entering into the data, but also trying to ask questions about things like how and why was that happening? And that gets back to this idea of both the Gossamer Network, but then also the ways in which this network functioned on the ground. The fact that it wasn't this kind of a big government bureaucracy with standalone buildings and its own kind of fleet of horse-drawn carriages. This is something that's being grafted onto a private infrastructure of store owners and stagecoach companies that allows it to then withdraw very quickly without having that permanent infrastructure left behind.
So why does that matter? Why should we care that that's the kind of network that was built?
Yeah, and so this is where it kind of gets into thinking about the history of the federal government and kind of what scholars term the American state. If we think about the federal government today, and I think oftentimes we might think of the word bureaucracy, this kind of top-down centralized system with people, again, working in government offices. And if you go looking for that in the 19th century, it's actually pretty difficult to find. And for a lot of decades, historians kind of interpreted that as the United States having effectively a kind of weak American state, a more limited government, especially compared to some of the more larger bureaucracies in Europe. Starting kind of the 1990s through the 2000s and up until the present, more and more historians have articulated the ways in which the American state was actually quite present and quite strong, stretching back to the early 1800s. What my book is doing, what I found that was kind of different and surprising about that was that there was this massive system that was utterly not a bureaucracy. Across the American countryside, this is not kind of centralized bureaucrats administering the system. This is a kind of more chaotic, ground up. You have private actors being paid small commissions. They're kind of moving in and out of the network. It's disappearing from places. It's just a very different model of governance than one that I was used to. And the implication of that, at least that I'm kind of arguing, is that this actually had enormous implications for the settlement and occupation of the Western United States. That it was precisely because there was not this kind of top-down centralized bureaucracy that the US Post was able to spread and occupy all of these different places so quickly, facilitate this larger process of settler colonial occupation. And it all kind of revolved around the way in which this network operated. And if you start to see that, you realize that there are actually all sorts of different areas of federal government at the time that are operating along this kind of similar system.
That's a very elegant explanation of a very complex series of debates. Why should we care if the state was weak or not in the earlier period? Why have so many people written about that?
I think in part that's also a very complex question that I'm probably going to mangle here. Again, all these kind of decades-long debates between scholars that are much smarter than me.
Okay. You give one good answer, it just breeds another question. So
there you go. I think there's a couple of reasons for it. I think one is that questions about the role of government in American society have always been central to kind of American politics, and even more so in the late 20th century into the present. I think even right now, right, as we're debating this kind of infrastructure plan, this giant, people are calling it, right, the New Deal of the Biden administration. So many of those debates are around what should be the role of government in American society. And so I think trying to understand that history, there are real kind of modern stakes on both sides for people arguing that actually we've always had a more limited government. That was kind of the founding fathers envisioned this kind of limited government versus, people on the other side might want to say, no, actually, there's always been an activist government and state stretching back to the nation's founding, right? So those are some of the kind of more contemporary political stakes involved. I think from a purely historical perspective, I would say that there are so many dimensions of this period in American history, the 1860s through the end of the 1800s, that you cannot fundamentally understand without understanding the role of the federal government in that. And Western expansion, settler colonial occupation of the West, of indigenous land, is probably one of the most important of those examples. The federal government was deeply involved in this period of Western expansion through all sorts of different mechanisms. The US Army that I've talked about already, the Homestead Act, which is basically providing public land to people who are willing to kind of move onto these places. But then also, I think what I'm trying to argue is that public institutions and networks like the Post, that on first glance, again, it's just kind of ubiquitous everywhere, maybe kind of apolitical, actually had a hugely important role to play in the region, and trying to understand the different modes and avenues that government power took, I think is actually really important for understanding this period.
So my OUP book from this era of the South in exactly the same decades, it's like a reverse image of the West. The men in power were trying to restrict the power of the federal government because of its intervention in the rights of Black people to advocate. So and they gave away a lot. You know, a lot of the development, when you look at your maps of the post offices and things, you know, the South sacrificed a lot in its resistance to that federal power. I wonder if you might call up your site again and show folks a few of the other maps to give a sense of, to illustrate the argument that you're making. And as I said, the press did a great job of like snapshots of these in the book itself. But if you show us a few things that you think are particularly cool, to use the technical language.
Right, at the very scholarly
Yeah.
there. That should have been like, you know, one of the blurb on the back, right? Just cool. So this is an accompanying website called GossamerNetwork.com that I built with an enormously talented developer named Yan Wu, who now actually works in data journalism for the Wall Street Journal. And so this is, you can kind of have a map-based interface on the left side of the screen, and then scroll through and see some of these really big spatial patterns on the right, along with kind of accompanying narrative text that's guiding the viewer through. So in this case, I'm flipping between unceded native land in 1848 versus what this kind of looked like in 1877. And obviously you're seeing the kind of expansion of the US military through this process of dispossession. But you can also map out the expansion of the postal network as well, right, across different periods of time, and then show and highlight different patterns that are going on in the spread of this network. And I think one reason why I ended up developing this website was that I think to try to, again, getting back to this idea of scale, trying to conceptualize some of these really, really big patterns can be really difficult. And I think, you know, written prose has a lot of strengths to it, but trying to see some of these big spatial patterns, they're so much more effective if they're on a map in front of you. And rather than me trying to kind of tortuously work them into a book in narrative format, or kind of reduce these interactive visualizations into just a bunch of, you know, small snapshots in a book, I tried to kind of move a lot of some of those larger spatial patterns onto an accompanying website, so that the book itself could focus a little bit more on kind of the narrative and argumentative side of it. So,
well, it's a beautiful site. I'll shamelessly say that I've built one that sort of rhymes with it right now, called Southern Journey, that maps migration of Black, white, indigenous, and immigrant people across the South. And it run into the same challenge you do, is that words and maps don't want to exist on the same space, right? You don't want to say, well, as you can see, well, no, that's already boring, right? So I think that's sort of the next stage of digital history, something you and I have actually thought about for a while. How do we tell new stories with the digital? And I think your book's a real landmark in that, Cameron, that you're finding ways to make it human and engaging, and to engage the larger literature at the same time you're showing new things. Speaking of seeing new things, I see Erin appearing on our screen, which I take to be a sign that not everybody out there in the world has found every question they might have about this book answered by our
your conversation has been fantastic, but there are a few points where people would like us to drill in. And I'll introduce myself to the audience. I'm Erin Cox from Oxford University Press. And we do have a few questions from the audience just about various aspects of the conversation.
Right.
Cameron, can I ask first, you said that the post offices could be as small as someone's home. How did those get set up? What was the process by which you set up a post office?
A very, very official process. So I was kind of shocked by this. Again, we think of the government today, we tend to think of kind of onerous paperwork, and you have to file a million forms before anything can get done. And what would effectively happen for a lot of these small places is settlers would kind of, again, move on to these places. And then all you had to really do was get a bunch of signatures onto a petition and then send it to Washington. And almost overwhelmingly, the US postal system was like, okay, you can have a post office. And within a month or two, they would send out a kind of official form for whoever is being nominated as the postmaster. So the local store owner, let's say, they'd fill it out. They'd have to find a couple financial backers as kind of a surety to guarantee, guard against theft. They'd send the stuff back, and then they'd send a contract with a stagecoach company to add a new stop on their route, and people would get it in mail in the matter of a couple months.
Well, back in earlier decades, that had been a highly political process, right? Getting to be a postmaster or postmistress was a huge. This sounds pretty depoliticized, wasn't it?
Oh, it's highly politicized. So the actual process itself is very easy, right? But the selection of who is the postmaster, where that post office is located within a town, is highly politicized. And that was another surprise that I had, was that if you go into the archives and read papers and letters and diaries by politicians and congressmen at the time, you will just be shocked at how much ink they're spilling about stupid things like, where's the post office in some town in their district? And Americans care deeply about this. And they're writing letters in, they're saying it shouldn't be in this guy's store, it should be in this guy's store. And oftentimes that revolves around politics, right? So whichever party is in charge of the executive branch, the presidency, controls who gets to be postmasters. And what you see is this kind of carousel where every time the presidency changes parties, 10,000 plus postmasters are kicked out of office, and then 10,000 new ones are installed who oftentimes line up with the kind of new, let's say, Republican administration.
I'm shocked. So is that something that makes it non-bureaucratic? Is that it's so politicized?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of the argument of the book, is that, again, I'm just kind of struck by all these different dimensions of the ways in which this network is spreading and operating, is being driven on the ground by settlers moving to new places, local politicians petitioning people in Washington, and then political pressure from politicians there, Congress people, and that even these kind of administrators in Washington who might be very dedicated to what we think of as more civil service, kind of public service, they're kind of overwhelmed, right? They don't have the capacity to send out someone to the middle of Montana and figure out, does this town actually need a post office? Is this necessary or not? And so they're basically, granting it. And then I was also struck too that through the 1880s, the post office department itself is not in charge of establishing new mail routes. And so what happens is Congress has that power. And so every year they're passing bills that are establishing thousands of new post routes across the country. And this is a form basically of pork, right? Of saying to your constituents, I established 10 new mail routes in your district. And the poor post office department is in charge of actually trying to implement service in these places. So again and again through the end of the century, I was really struck by kind of the lack of bureaucratic oversight, especially and mostly in kind of rural parts of the country. It was a different system in urban areas in particular, but across the Western countryside, this is a really non-bureaucratic process in a lot of ways.
Would sometimes people move maybe from the east out west, and if they didn't have power in the east or something, and they thought, oh, I can establish power by becoming a postmaster or something like that? Did people do that?
I'm not sure being a postmaster was enough to move to rural Wyoming. Sorry, no shots at Wyoming right now. But it was, once you were there, there actually was a lot of aspects of the job that the reason why people cared so deeply was not because it paid well, right? Most postmasters were getting paid, less than $100 a year. Instead, what it did was it basically forced people in the surrounding community to regularly come to you. And if you're a store owner, obviously, that means you have a regular stream of customers coming into your store that have to go and get their mail. The reason for this is because prior to around 1900 or so, across most of the rural United States, you didn't get mail delivered to your door. You had to go to the local post office to both send and receive mail. And this meant that post offices became effectively centers of the community, kind of revolving points where people would have to meet regularly. And so that had all sorts of commercial implications. But also, if you were the postmaster, that meant that people were coming there and gathering and gossiping and sharing news. You were the most plugged in person in that community because you were a postmaster. And that's kind of why people squabbled so much over who would be the postmaster and where the post office was located.
Could you say a few words about women who have this job?
I was just going to ask that question. Good
Oh,
job,
sorry.
Ed. We're on the same page now. That's
right,
great.
good.
Perfect.
There you go. Yeah, so starting in the 1870s, accelerating through the end of the century, what I found was more and more women were serving as postmasters, and this was especially true in the Western United States. And so I kind of came across this table of effectively an internal audit or census that the Post did, where they were kind of tabulating up how many women were serving as postmasters in different states across the country. And overwhelmingly, the highest kind of rates of women serving in this role were in the Western United States. And it's a really fascinating idea that in my kind of argument that because this was such a localized network in many ways, right? Your interactions with a postmaster was not some faceless bureaucrat in DC, but it was the local store owner. And I think this actually gave a lot of women in these communities an entry point into office holding, federal office holding for the first time that might not be available to them otherwise, right? And so you had women who are able to kind of be postmasters because it's this more localized and formal role. You also had, in many cases, which will probably surprise no one, male postmasters basically delegating all responsibilities and work to their wives or daughters, who are not officially a part of the system necessarily, but they're the ones handing over letters, they're the ones sorting them, they're the ones, you know, taking mail sacks out to the stagecoach. And so again and again, I was kind of seeing that as well, which I think kind of goes hand in hand with this more official office holding role.
That's interesting. Yeah. We're talking mostly about the West. At the same time in the East, were there changes being made in the Postal Service there as well? Can you describe some of those?
Yep. So the Eastern United States, it kind of depends on where you are in the East. And the bigger division is, in my mind at least, a little bit less West versus East and more rural versus urban. So especially in the Northeastern United States is a much more urban area of the country during this time. Well, by certain measures is more urban. And what you're seeing there is the earlier seeds of a more, what we would think of as a more modern bureaucracy starting to take root during this period. So at big, you know, urban post offices like New York, Philadelphia, Boston, that's where you had this top-down hierarchical system where the postmaster was really a manager of, 30 letter carriers, let's say, and then also clerks in the office doing paperwork and distributing mail, right? Much more traditional kind of bureaucratic models that we would think of today. So again, I think that's probably the difference there. And the way in which you can see this play out is that in Congress, some of the debates around things like post office appropriations were not breaking down across party lines like we might expect, obviously, today, of kind of Republicans versus Democrats, but oftentimes it was rural versus urban, right? So you saw Republicans and Democrats from rural parts of the country, right? Montana teaming up with someone from Alabama, despite the fact that one's a Democrat and one's a Republican, let's say, to kind of oppose any attempts to pare back the system. And so I think that was also a moment for me. I was like, oh, that's what's happening here.
Yeah, for sure. Another question that came in is, can you talk about the role of the mail in families becoming more disparate with brothers, sisters, and different generations not living near each other?
Yep, and so this is a period of tremendous mobility. I mean, obviously, Ed has written an entire book kind of showing a lot of this mobility across a longer time period. But you see millions of Americans moving all across the country. And the mail is really tying them together. Again, as I said before, you're not going to be using a telegram necessarily to stay in touch with your sister from 600 miles away. And so in the second chapter of the book, I actually look at this really remarkable archive of letters that's in the Huntington Library from the Curtis family, who were a group of 4 orphans in the 1800s, all of whom eventually moved to the Western United States, but never actually really lived together. And there's about 24 letters, surviving letters or so across 4 decades. And going through those one by one and recognizing the ways in which these letters, of which they're just kind of a fraction of what they actually sent, was keeping them tied together. So family members that really actually didn't spend much time together beyond the age of children were exchanging letters across hundreds of miles, and not just letters, but also money orders to kind of support their brother who's struggling in Arizona, or sharing news about the birth of a daughter, or sending small gifts for a wedding. All these ways in which the mail is, again, tying together these families across these really, really massive distances.
Yeah. Well, and I'm still reeling at the fact that you were saying how little time it took to get, a piece of mail from one side of the country to the other. It's just unbelievable. Now I
Yeah,
think it actually takes longer now these days.
yeah, and looking at those letters, right? So one of the kind of youngest son, named Benjamin, is living in Arizona territory, in the middle of nowhere, right? He is writing about how the fact that it's basically just him and his animals. He's trying to start a ranch for company. The nearest doctor is a 30-mile ride away, the nearest kind of major city. And he's able to, again, he marries someone there, they have a daughter, and he shares that news that they are naming this daughter after his 2 sisters, and he sends that letter to San Diego. It gets there 5 days later,
Wow.
right? And so those connections, right, despite the fact that he's in the middle of nowhere, he's able to walk to a post office 20 minutes away from his house, right, a mile away, drop a letter off there, and 5 days later in San Diego, you have this family kind of hearing news about their niece.
Wow. And that's sort of the doctor being sort of 30 miles away brings up an interesting point. So sometimes would the sort of post office lead the charge in sort of developing a city, and the city would sort of grow up around it, or would it remain just an outpost for the most part?
I think probably the latter, and I want to be careful in not ascribing too much causal power to
Hmm.
the post. Right, we have a tendency to do that as authors, and when we focus on a subject, we start to kind of see it everywhere and assume maybe a little bit too much. But the way I see it is that the post was a kind of facilitative role that's moving hand in hand with all sorts of other institutions, and it's allowing them to operate much more easily than they would have otherwise, and oftentimes maybe expand and grow much more quickly, but it's not necessarily causing all of that, I would say. And I think because of the nature of the system, again, this kind of idea of a Gossamer network where it's able to withdraw from distant places is facilitating, I would say, a fairly unstable system of rural expansion during this period in the West. So you see extractive industry, mines popping up everywhere. And then, of course, there are busts that come from these places as well. So a mine might shut down within a couple of years, and then the post discontinues that post office, and there's thousands of these post offices that are shutting down very, very quickly. So
Yeah.
I,
Wow.
I noticed on your map that we have many fewer post offices now. You said that they peak around the beginning of the 20th century.
yep,
What explains that collapse?
yep. There's a three words: rural free delivery. And so if you look at the system, it looks like it might be kind of like shrinking or contracting or growing weaker or something like that. And that's actually not the case. It's basically just a sea shift in how the network is operating. So starting in the early 1900s, the postal system starts to expand a service known as rural free delivery, which is the modern way in which many of us get mail, which is where the mail comes directly to your door. And this had existed in larger cities since the 1860s. It spread in larger cities, but starting in the early 1900s, due in large part to a lot of lobbying from farmers' organizations. The Populist Party, for instance, was a big proponent of this. The U.S. Post started delivering mail to different rural parts of the country. And so that was the kind of sea shift where suddenly you don't need a post office within a couple miles of everyone, right? And you can start to kind of consolidate the network when it comes to these post offices.
sort of for younger viewers, that's why Mayberry RFD. If you're wondering why those letters are there and what they mean, that signals that it's a rural place, right? It's kind of, I don't know if it's actually accurate, since Mayberry seems to be a town, but that's a topic for another discussion. But that's what it means. I'm sorry, Aaron. I just
No, Ed, jump in anytime.
About these things, right?
No, I just have one more question. So Cameron, you sort of mentioned that there's the potential for fraud. Did you discover some stories of fraud that maybe there's one great story that you want to share with us of some kind of postal fraud being committed?
Yeah, I think the big ones are this kind of stagecoach industry sprouting up, and the ones I just kind of love are basically this process of getting a mail contract involves the post office department advertising, saying, okay, we have a 400-mile a mail line that goes through these places, and then a stagecoach company would say, I can operate that route for $20,000, whatever it is. And what you have sprouting up is that people in Washington who had literally never set foot anywhere near these mail routes were bidding for them without any intention of ever starting service. And it was this system of kind of what was called straw bidding, where people would step in and say, yeah, I can carry that for $20,000, which is completely impossible in the West. And then they would, once they had that contract, go to an actual stagecoach company and basically say, how much do you want this for? That kind of relationship there. And so this kind of fuzzy relationship between companies, politicians, lobbyists, right? You had all sorts of companies like giving gifts to postal administrators. And this kind of coalesced in the early, late 1870s and early 1880s when a former senator from Arkansas became kind of embroiled in this massive scheme. They were caught. It was actually national news and one of the kind of forgotten episodes of corruption and fraud during a period that's infamous for having a lot of corruption and fraud.
Wow.
So I have one as a final question here, Cameron.
Yeah.
We know the post office is in crisis today. What lessons or perspective can we draw from your book about where we are right now?
Yeah, this might be a new record of 56 minutes before Louis the conversation here. So I mean, I think there's I have several thoughts about the current state of the U.S. postal system. The most important one, I think, would be that this conception that the U.S. Postal Service today somehow needs to be operating and covering all its own costs is a fairly modern phenomenon. This is really from 1970 onwards that this was established. But at the same time, despite the fact that it's kind of mandated that it's cut off from taxpayer funding, right? It's supposed to cover all its costs. It's also supposed to provide a universal public service. And to me, that kind of tension there just is not sustainable, especially given the current landscape of electronic communication, the internet, right? This is not something that can work moving forward. And so for me, it's less kind of like, oh, we need to harken back to its original roots as a public service. I actually think, history doesn't need to determine the present and the future. It's really a question of like, what do we want this system to look like and to be in the 21st century? And that's a real conversation that needs to be hammered out in real ways instead of it just kind of staggering forward in its current state.
So you're not calling for the return of stagecoaches?
He's launching a stagecoach, company next week. Yeah.
Great.
No.
Well, thanks very much, Aaron. I'll hand it over to you to wrap things up.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you, Cameron. This was such a great conversation. And if anybody wants to know more about Cameron's book, Paper Trails, I've put the link in the chat. And thank you all for joining the OUP History Book Club. And thank you to my colleague, Susan, who this is her brilliant idea. And she has put the two of you together for this very rich conversation. So I thank you both for joining us. And we hope to see all of you again in the future.
My pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.